Module 5, Intro to Psychology. Today we will talk about memory. And I would like to say that this is one of my fascinating topics. I say this every week. I'm very passionate about psychology. But it's one of the most fascinating topics because we are studying. And one of the things that we might want to ask ourselves is, how can we study better? How can we remember better? And memory is such a complex and beautiful topic because it defines who we are as people. We might in fact argue from a philosophical or even experiential perspective that without our memories, it's really hard to know who we are. Because after all, we are made up by bodies and minds, but everything else that defines our interactions, our loves, our passions, our frustrations, our whole emotional background, and also the way we interact in the world, the maps of meaning in the world, are very closely related to our memories. And so in this module, we will talk about how memory is created, produced, retrieved, utilized, and of course, some of it will have to do with brain function and brain anatomy. We will talk about how memories define who we are in terms of psychological traits or characteristics, perhaps if memory is involved in personality, perhaps if memory is involved in psychopathology, or at least from a more matter-based perspective in neurological issues and problems. But we'll also talk about memories in the context of research. And in terms of research, how do we know the extent that we can improve our memories? For instance, if you want to prepare for a study, for a quiz, or if we want to prepare ourselves from any other type of challenge we have in the world. So many topics this week. And I wrote down a few notes. It's kind of interesting that in order for me to remember what I need to talk to you about, I have to write a few things down. But this is very important because similar to what we said previously about learning and conditioning, there are a few terms and labels that we need to utilize, some of which are still part of the neuroscientific debate. One of the examples will be long-term, mid-term, and short-term memory, but also to provide you with some level of investigation so that you can be better prepared for the quiz and for the semester in general. All right, so let's begin. Memory. Memory has to do with the mind. So I usually like to start with some word analysis. Now you should know me and my proclivity, my inclination for understanding what we say based on history or etymology. So one of the first terms that I want to bring to your attention is mnemony, okay, mnemini, okay, and mnemosis, both connected to memory, okay? And already at this level, we might decide to talk about different types of memorization, okay? I will skip the connection with mythology, especially Greco-Roman mythology or archaic symbolic meaning for now. But let's try to utilize the most commonly seen English terms in this sense. Just wait for the planes to pass. All right, okay, so first term, to remember, okay? Remember, okay? Then recollect. More revision. And perhaps we could add record. And collect alone. So let's separate the re, right? Okay. And think about memory in terms of what type of body areas or organs we're talking about. So let's start from that first one, remember, okay, which really talks about any body member, we could say. So this is a really straightforward connection to the body in general, not really specified, at least not at this level. Okay, so we remember using our body. Okay. Now, remember, it's connected, of course, to this and this, memories in general, things we remember, okay? So it's almost a tautology, we would call this in logic or in philosophy tautology, okay? An empty container of a thing that doesn't really add any information. We remember memory, something that we remember, right, with our body. You could say that the body is the container and also the tool that we use to remember. Then we have to recollect, okay? And recollect is a combination of collection, right? Collection, something we put together. So at this level, you're not just have memories, but you have categories, right? Categories, okay? So you remember single things and then you put them into a box and then multiple boxes, which in turn will be categorized in terms of what they signify, okay? Now, there is a term connected to this one they did not add. I will add it right now, and it will be remind, okay? Now, in English, okay, we tend to use this in a context or example of being reminded of something, right? And just as remember has to do with the body, the member, remind, as the name implies, is connected to our favorite thing about the body, the mind. Okay, we remember more specifically with our mind. Okay, not surprising here because from a psychological perspective, this predominates. It's mind over matter or matter over mind, but still we need to use the mind to remember things, right? And being reminded of something has also to do with some level of biographical information. Okay, I've been reminded of something that either I experienced directly or through another media. For example, being reminded of the page I previously studied or the song I previously heard, etc., etc. Now, being reminiscent of something, okay, is the straightforward connection with mnemosis and mnemony, okay, the act of remembering. And this is similar to what you can find on Québécois license plates, our neighbors in Canada, right? Je me souviens. And it's a concept that it's not just memory in terms of collection of things, but it's also something that has to do with an emotional, psychological component. It is as if I am able to go back in time and relive certain things. So this term is connected with reliving something, okay? Reliving something, okay? Bring things back to life, okay? Now, to some extent, this is not surprising to you because let's think about how you remember something that is carrying an emotional weight, okay? Your first kiss, for instance, okay? Or your first love, your first hug, okay? Now, you might not remember everything about the circumstances. For instance, you might not remember your first hug as a child, but I bet you will remember your first kiss. And this is something that is relived each time we think about it. And we are brought back to that state of affairs. To some extent, it will be connected to what we said in week 2 and 3 in regard to the olfactory bulb and how important olfaction is. You've been brought back to a state of affairs that might be 10 years removed from the current moment, and yet it's as if you're reliving it right now. This is also connected to something that you can experience through media, like you listen to a song and you be reminded of something in a lively way, in a alive way, as if your life over there is the same as your life over here in a temporal manner. And finally, to record, which is one of the most fascinating one, because record, I will write it maybe down here, record is RE again. And at this point, I think you remember what RE means in an etymological sense as a prefix. Nothing to do with that note, the musical note, right? But it has to do with again. Re means to be doing something again, a repetition. So record, okay? Cord comes from the Latin term for heart, okay? So interesting enough, you can remember with your mind, be reminded, or with your heart. Isn't it a fascinating thing to think about? Now you might wonder, well, this is interesting, at least from a linguistic literary perspective, connecting the mind and connecting the heart, right? Sounds very wonderful. But it's also a really good description of how memories actually work in our bodies. So how can we define this? Well, the first thing that I would like to mention is that memories have to do with something that exists outside of time and space, but they do exist each time we add life to them. We bring them back to life. Now, let's start from a very basic neurological perspective. If one were to ask you, okay, you study psychology and you study memory, where in the brain are memories located? Your straightforward answer should be the hippocampus, okay? Or one of the primary answers should include the hippocampus. If you remember the hippocampus, the hippocampal structure is that part of the brain that is shaped like this, roughly speaking, right? All right. Write it down here, hippocampus. The hippocampus. The term itself should remind you of the shape. Okay? The shape is like a seahorse, okay? And that's where the word comes from. I will add this, even though we mentioned that in week 1, perhaps. Hippo is Greek for horse, okay? Yeah, horse, okay. So hippocampus has the structure that really looks like a horse. Or rather, sorry, a seahorse, all right? All right, good. Now, let's continue. When we think about the hippocampus, we also think about different type of memories and the fact that something in the brain is telling us what to do with it. Now, you might disagree with this because every time I say the brain is telling us what to do with it, it sounds as if we are deprived of free will, right? We are deprived of the ability to make sense of life and make decisions on our own. Now, I mentioned free will multiple times in my courses because it's connected to every single module, right? So free will, from a very basic perspective, would mean that we are free, all right, as human beings at least, okay, of willing something into action, okay, or willing to do something inferior, okay? I am free to decide what to eat today, okay? I will be less free to decide what to do today, what to eat today, if I have a very nice menu in front of me, I'm very hungry, and I'm not really free to choose perhaps the healthiest option because something is very vivid in my memory and my aesthetic perception calls me to pick that one, that specific item in the menu. I will also be less free, for instance, if in a sequence of action, the one that is presented to me first appears to be the easiest one, so that the other options are not as, again, vivid, they're presented less vividly to me. Okay? Now, I will be also less free if there are some level of constriction or boundaries around me, all right? For instance, I cannot express my freedom in full if there is something physical that prevents me to do so. Example, I might be a little sick, I might have a little sore throat or headache, and I'm less free to fully express my cognitive strength because my body doesn't feel good, Okay. Now, of course, free will has also to do with a spectrum of possibilities within which there might be a gradient on a hierarchy, more or less free, right? Other example will be more or less free, translated in either fully free or less free if you are a prisoner, for instance. So you might be free to think about anything you want inside a prison, right? So a cell, but you will not be free to walk around, okay? So if freedom means to walk around, it's either yes or no. I'm not free to walk outside, okay? Pretty straightforward, binary. But you can see walking as a spectrum, as a gradient, and you might say, I am free to walk around the perimeter of my cell, within the cell itself, but I'm not free to walk outside of it, all right? How does that apply to memory? Well, one of the terms that I would like you to remember is the term confabulation, okay? Confabulation. And it's one of the phenomena in memory that creates a not precise recollection, confabulation, okay? Now, to recollect, to retrieve also means to bring things back to life, as in remember things as they occur, okay? Now, the term confabulation comes from the Latin cum, right? And you should remember that because it has to do with the etymology we previously encountered. So with, okay, with or together, okay. Sometimes even at once, okay. All right. Then Asian, you should remember because it has to do with action, okay. So putting something into action. And then fabul comes from the Latin fabula, okay. Fabula, which could be roughly translated as tale, narration, even fairy tale, okay? Sometimes a moral tale, a moral narrative, a story to teach us something, okay? Think about Phaedrus in Greek, or think about Catullus in a term, think about the Grimms, etc., etc. Now, confabulation is pretty much confusing a memory that you think happened to you with something that happened to someone else, okay? And the connection between these two can be very, very varied, okay? So you might have a basic level of source misattribution, okay? Okay. Source misattribution. Okay. Oops, sorry. Well, source misattribution. And this is to do more with forgetting, or rather remembering something in an inaccurate manner, like you attribute a source of your knowledge to something that is not accurate. For instance, you think a friend of yours told you something about that news, but you actually heard it from the news on TV, okay? But confabulation brings a second level of interpretation. Those memories might also never have happened to you, all right? So the point here is that you might remember something that does not exist anywhere when it comes to your own reality. And so in this sense, you're less free. Why? Because you're creating a world that does not exist, and you might remember this world in a way that is presenting a negative effect to your own life. So there are plenty of studies that indicate that. For instance, some studies talk about memories that were created from scratch. There is one study where a graduate student was telling his little brother, I believe Chris was his name, do you remember that time where you got lost in the mall? We were there with our family, it was me, you, and mom and dad. And then this old gentleman was so kind to bring you back to us. And then later on, the child, the little brother said, "Oh yes, I do remember. Yeah, it was an elderly gentleman dressed so and so, with a receding hairline or slightly heavy, had this, voice and these characteristics, etc. Was wearing this or that. I do remember that." Now notice that this little brother, this Chris, if I remember correctly, was never lost. He never got lost in the mall. This was an entirely created memory for the sake of experimentation, not to make fun of his little brother, from scratch. So what happened is that this little brother was not necessarily trying to be creating a false representation on purpose, was not trying to either get attention or to provoke a reaction or to lie. But this child was convinced after the fact, not only that it did not occur in that manner, but after a fact that did not exist. So this is another layer that not only we can be very inaccurate in the way we remember things, but we might also be confusing and confounding multiple things after something happened. So to explain things further, let's assume that you might have an event E here, okay? This is the event, okay? Let's call it E1, okay? E1 means the event did occur. E2, option 2, the event did not occur, okay? And then let's do E3, the event occurred in a slightly different way as we remember, okay? Now, we might assume that usually this is what happened, okay? Let's call this B and call this A, okay? Very often we think that this is what happens, okay? Something happens and we remember just as it happens, okay? We might forget a few details here and there, but we have no doubt that we remember things as they were, okay? They're presented to us. E2, okay? Let's call this A, okay? The event is retrieved, okay? This time, however, okay, again as E1B. So the event did not occur, and yet we remember it in just the same way as this, okay? Okay. In E3, again, we might have time in between, okay? And at this point, we might remember either, again, an E1B, okay, or perhaps something that we never experienced before, and let's call this E3C or something like that, okay? Just attribute a random number here. What does this mean? It simply means that sometimes there are things that are easily remembered, not on their own. So rather than think about all these numbers here, I would like you to focus on this, okay? Time. And this would be relevant for a variety of reasons. So let's remove the memory for a second. Okay? And let us focus on time. So time is what separates the event itself from the retrieval process that will allow us to remember it more or less accurately. Okay? So the first thing to keep in mind is time passes and passes in a different way, all right? So if we just look at time for the sake of time, you might find that in memory, you have short term memory, okay? You might have mid-term memory, and I'll put this in parentheses because there is some disagreement as to the existence of mid-term memory or whether mid-term memory belongs to the last one, long-term term memory, right? Okay. Now, for now, we'll resume this. Time itself already is telling you something about this, okay? In terms of what you observe here, we're just talking about the length of time, okay? For how long you remember something. Not so much what type of time frame you have here, what happens in here, okay? But just for how long. For now, just keep this in mind, that in order for a memory to go from short term to long term, so to be remembered in a much longer way, in a longer time, you need a process that we call, according to neuroscience, LTP, or long-term potentiation. Okay. Now, this is just the level of time that passes, but there's more to it. All right, so let's talk about time, and later on we'll talk about LTP more in detail. Now, if you remember, we said that there is something as a source mixture attribution. Okay, so let's assume that you have these three levels, and then you have source mixture attribution right here. Source misattribution. Okay, right here. Okay. Now, you might wonder, is there anything shorter than short? So let's give us some numbers to work with. With short-term memory, we're talking about, roughly speaking, 30 seconds, okay? 30 seconds, okay? But anything that is like between 1 to 2 seconds, okay, roughly speaking, is usually called sensory register, okay? So this is technically not necessarily what we would call memory, and yet is the primary system that allows memory to work. Now, the sensory register has to do with senses, as the name implies, and with what? It's a register, right? So to record something, as the discussion that we had earlier about words implied. So sensory register is something that enters the system via our sensory stimulation and lingers there for a few seconds only before the system itself, the brain, the central nervous system, will make it into long-term memory, okay? Now, if there is no further rehearsal, then the memory will disappear. So what does that mean? It means that you need some sense of rehearsal, okay? And this rehearsal can be trained, for instance, with so-called chunking, right? Chunking techniques to remember things and to train the system to remember things in a much more, in a longer and perhaps in a more precise manner. We shall see how that is. Now, what does that research indicate? Since we talk about numbers, okay, this is a discussion, but how do we know this to be true, and how do we know the specific values? Now, any random person is able to remember from a list of items, random words, random labels, concepts, etc., roughly speaking, 7, and this is a number I would like you to remember, okay, 7 plus minus 2 items, okay? Example, think about numbers, okay? How many digits remember? With no rehearsal, no practice, none. On average, we remember 7 plus minus 2 numbers. Okay, so some people remember around 5, some people remember 9, but on average, 7 plus minus 2 numbers. The research is also indicating that in a sequence of words, names, or number, we tend to remember the very first one, the best, and the very last one right after. And progressively, as we go to the center part of the column of the list, we remember those things not as well. Okay? Moreover, the research also indicates that we might remember words that have some level of cognitive structure in common more than the ones that do not possess that characteristic. For instance, if I were to say words, all of which represent, I don't know, architecture, for instance, or interior design, if I'm saying table and chair and computer and desk, etc., that all of these words will be compartmentalized by the brain in a specific area. Now, the problem with that is that we might create memories that might or might not be attached to it. So for instance, if I say all these words, and then I say a word that is represented as an outlier, I don't know, flower, you might remember the flower as an outlier, okay? But then I might say something that I did not mention previously. I'm going to ask you, so do you remember when I mentioned, I don't know, window? And you might be more prone to say, yes, of course, because in a, let me use the term subconscious level, I'm not using psychoanalytic terms now, but more generally speaking, on a subconscious level, you might have thought that I said window simply because you attributed the desk, the table, the chair, etc. to a room, and therefore you might say to yourself, yeah, sure, the window also belongs to a room, so why not? He probably mentioned window, despite the fact that I never said window in the first place. So I put source of attribution here because I mentioned confabulation, right? And this creation of memories from things that might or might not be real in terms of real or attributed to us. Source misattribution can happen when, before the event itself and the retrieval time, something happened that might have caused our memory to be impacted after the fact, afterwards, okay? So in practice, you might remember something more vividly if there's nothing in between, which also means that the research appears to indicate that you remember things better if you don't have anything else that is happening after that. So you might infer from this that you might study right before going to bed because you don't have anything happening to you, and so you might be more likely to remember the things you study because you're sleeping afterwards. Now, this is not necessarily true in all cases, well, for two main reasons. First of all, because the things you experience afterwards might also have to do with the memory. For instance, let's assume that you're watching this video in the morning, right? And then throughout the day, you rehearse, okay, the content of the video, so you're studying it. So what happens after watching this video makes the content of the video itself more likely to be remembered the day after, in 2 days, etc., because you're rehearsing it, okay? Or if you watch this video right before going to bed, aside from the fact that you should not do that, okay, I definitely not recommend from a neurological, psychological perspective, be exposed to media, especially digital media, blue light, computers, any type of screens before going to bed. It's a very, very bad idea, okay? And we'll talk about that when we will discuss sleeping patterns and melatonin production and REM phases, etc. But also, it's not true that your brain is just asleep throughout, the nighttime. The brain might be very much awake, and by might be, I'm intending to say that it's not true the brain just go to sleep. However, by comparing that activity to quote unquote real daytime activity, you have more evidence of the fact that if you study something and you close your book, okay, or you close, the little notebook they use to write down notes, and then you just go to sleep, you might have less interfering mechanisms that might create a source misattribution, might create some sort of gap and change in the way you remember the memory. I will also like to tell you a story, a very brief story that I would say the vast majority of professors in psychology will probably quote every time we talk about memory, because it's such an important and instrumental story that talks about things such as perfect memory, visual memory, book-like memory, or flashbulb memory, this recollection of a very vivid memory, something that really brings you back and you have all these colorful ways to remember things. Flashbulb memory, very, very important. And also any type of memory that is photographic, okay? So something that you remember with very, very high levels of accuracy. And it's a story of a mnemonist, okay, that a psychologist studied in Russia. A mnemonist as a professional remembering master, professional master of all things memories. Okay? A mnemonist, okay? Mnemonist, which in the scientific literature is referred to as S. Okay? And the psychologist that not necessarily studied him only, but popularized his story is Alexander Luria, okay, or Luria. Okay, he worked with Lev Vygotsky, etc., etc. We'll talk about Lev Vygotsky later on, but let's talk about this story for a little bit, and you can find plenty of resources that talk about it. So what happened to this individual? This individual was a journalist working for a newspaper, and he used to go to different events and report on the news, as many other journalists would do. And his boss one day told him, make sure to bring a notebook to write all the important details down so we know who said what and how it happened, and you don't forget any details. Please do that, because it's very, very important. And this person said, there's no need for that. I remember everything. And so his boss was a little puzzled by it. What do you mean you remember everything? You're going to make mistakes. It's impossible for you to remember everything. No, I never make mistakes. And so his boss said, okay, well, you know, I'll make you learn the lesson the hard way. So he called all the colleagues in the newspapers and presented this person, this journalist, with a narration, a text that he read to him. Okay, notice he never heard this before. Okay, so he read from this text only once and said, do you remember any of the word I said? And this individual was able to repeat every single word in the correct order, just once, with an immensely high level accuracy. Now, the interesting thing is that you might think, wow, this is wonderful. I wish I had photographic memory. I wish I could remember everything without rehearsal, without chunking, without studying. Would it be wonderful? Would it be a superpower? So what's the point of even going to school and rehearse? You just listen to this video once and that's it, okay? You read one thing once and that's it. Nothing to remember, nothing to rehearse, no time wasted, so to speak, if you think about what we said about learning and conditioning. Now, the interesting thing is that this individual did not know that he was an exception. So when he was asked, how is it possible that you remember everything in a perfect way? And his reply was like, what do you mean? It isn't something that everybody experiences. He thought that everybody was remembering things with no problem whatsoever. And there are more things that are kind of interesting about his life. Eventually, he became a professional mnemonist, and we remember everything about multiple things and multiple names in a room full of people. He remember every single name. Now, notice we're talking about Russia, so it's a Slavic patronymic system. So you remember the first name, the family name, and the patronymic, right? The name that's attributed to the genitive case of the father, for instance, Vladimir Petrovich Ivanov or something like that, right? So you always remember every name, and then he also became some sort of, maybe guru, it's not a correct word, but a healer, spiritual, natural healer that was an expert in herbal medicine and many other things. So he created a life for himself, but at the same time, by his own account, his life was actually very difficult. We might think that having perfect memory is the best thing that could ever happen to us, but just think about the fact that he was not able to forget anything. So two main problems are connected to this major issue. The first one is that you don't have the ability to forget things that you might not want to remember. So any type of trauma, any type of negative emotion, it's right there, and there's no way you can leave that aside. The second problem is that you cannot have a zooming in attention level. Everything is upfront. So he was recounting that when he had family dinners or gatherings with friends, people get upset at him because they might say, "You're not paying attention to what I'm saying to you." And he was able to repeat every single word, and yet every single word triggered a variety of other memories that might have occurred 10 minutes before a conversation, 2 days before a conversation, or 20 years before the conversation. So everything was stimulated in his memory production. Not only that, but he also had this synesthetic memory retrieval process. And within synesthesia, okay, you remember again, SYN, similar to the Platinum plus aesthetics, right? That's the perception, right? Multiple senses stimulated at the same time, everything super vivid. Okay, so you might remember what they say, in what context, what the person was wearing, what type of smell was in the room, whether he ate something, and everything was brought to the forefront of his attention with no possibility to be removed. He even tried to get rid of his memory. He wrote down everything he remembered on a piece of paper and tried to burn the piece of paper, thinking that this might create some sort of link, of chain effect, you remember conditioning, and help him forget things, but that was to no avail, and he was not able to forget anything. So multiple things at the same time. So this is something that is akin to what I would say, careful what you wish for, careful for what you pray for, because you might actually get it, and it's not something that you might actually need. Not only that, but there is an element of self-doubt that is healing when we realize that our memories are fallible for specific reasons, because we should not bring everything back to our attention. There are things that we're supposed to forget because the details should not be as important. Think about a DSLR camera. If everything will be zoomed in and everything will be focused in the same manner, there will be no way to distinguish the background from the foreground, etc., etc. So perfect memories is really not something that we experience often as human beings. In fact, in the scientific literature, there was no other reported case that could possibly resemble what happened to him. There are probably people that have these perfect photographic memories, but we don't have any knowledge of where they are, where they live, and whether their memories is exactly the same as the one reported by Alexander Luria. So all fascinating things. There are two main topics that I would like to present to you, the last two parts of this lecture. One has to do with some very specific examples, and the other one more with kind of structure, labels, and processes that I would like you to remember. So let's start with the most interactive part. So I would like to present to you some renditions of experiments that have been done in the last, I would say, 100 years or so, in cognitive psychology, in clinical psychology, in psychological research in general. And it's a really, really long time. Now, if you think about Luria studied this patient that we just mentioned for about 30 years or so. And there are things that still surprise us when we study memories, and there are things that surprise us because we know what we know at this point. So it's nice to be shocked at times. So in order for me to do that, I will have to ask you this. Please watch the video. I will project some slides now, and I would like to ask you to do the things that are shown in the slide without rehearsing anything else. Now, some of these experiments, some of these tricks and exercises are so well known that the likelihood that you might be prepared for some of them is quite high, especially in an age of social media and digital sharing. So if you already know these experiments, well, do your best to rehearse them without trying to outperform yourself. Just try to be as natural as you possibly can. But otherwise, this is simply to show you what type of research is out there and how do we know what we know. So let's start with the first experiment or trick or experiential activity.
All right, so let's begin with our first activity, practical activity, a little exercise. This one is taken from George Sperling experiment. It's a variation of it. There are many versions. And the one I'm doing this is now with 4 rows, but then the original has 3 rows. Doesn't really matter. The question is, what letters do you see? Ready? Go. Okay, do you remember any? Should we do it again? Ready? You go. All right. So this is interesting to just stimulate your memory, and then I will show you all the letters, okay, to see if you remember any of that. How about the letters in the middle row? Now 3 rows only. Ready? Any of those? Try to think of it, and perhaps you can write them down. Okay, so just to test yourself, to test your memory. All right, so those were the letters. And would you like to know the full sequence? These were all the letters: A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, L, M, N, O, P, Q, which is interesting because it's pretty much our alphabet, right? At least the English version of the Latin, Roman, Italic alphabet. But the point is this: if you see them in this sequence, it doesn't really require a lot of knowledge. They're kind of automatic. It's very easy to recognize them in chunks. And that's part of the chunking strategies in our learning skills. But if you see them randomly, it's really, really hard to remember them, okay? At least at first. If you did this exercise multiple times, it should not be too complex of a thing, but that's precisely the point. All right, so let's move on. And let's talk about memory in general. Now, I divided here simple learning from higher order cognition, because memory usually is taught right after conditioning, or sometimes as a precursor to conditioning when we discuss different types of experiments. So you have simple learning with habituation, Pavlovian learning, if you remember, Ivan Pavlov and classical conditioning, instrumental learning or operant conditioning. We mentioned multiple studies by Skinner, by Thorndike, by Watson, etc. And then, of course, biological mechanisms, including what we will see as the creation and retrieval of memories. And of course, all the chemicals we previously mentioned, the sodium, potassium pump, neurogenesis, neuroplasticity, all of these plays a very important role. And then you have higher order cognition, where we encounter declarative versus non-declarative memories, spatial learning, and then, of course, clinical cases that are really important to discuss things such as Korsakov's, Wernicke, et cetera, et cetera. We'll see how that works. But in general, since I mentioned that, beside showing you some experiments and exercise, I want to show you how memory and learning occurs. The first thing I want to mention is that as you probably experienced yourself multiple times, there is a rapid decay of memory if you do not rehearse anything. So as you can see in this little graph by Lloyd Peterson and Margaret Peterson, you can see the curve that really goes down quite rapidly from a 90 percentile all the way to close to 0 when time in seconds between presentation of consonants and recall request. This is pretty straightforward. If you try to remember something without practice, the likelihood that you remember that it's really, really low. Doesn't surprise really too much. It's something to experience multiple times, but the question may be, okay, so if no rehearsal obviously doesn't really help memory, is there anything that could help in this area? Well, we'll see. One of the examples, it's taken from the research studies, multiple ones by Ebbinghaus, and this is called the learning curve. So again, you see that on one side, you have the memory retention in percentiles from 100% down to 60%, and then the time expressed here in days. So you see that if you first learn something, you have a straightforward capacity for remembering. And now we did already mention the difference between the sensory register, short-term memory, mid-term memory, and long-term memory. But eventually, already within the end of the first day, you already lost 20% of what you learned right away on average, right? So the curve really goes down. Each time you review, however, you see that something happens. The curve becomes more and more elevated, more flatter, but on the upper percentile there, right? So you see that already, if you start after the second day, the second day after the retrieval is already pretty high in comparison to the first one. And then on the third, you can see that by the fourth day, it's around 90%. And on the sixth day, you can do the same thing. So reviewing materials is really a good strategy. Now, we are all different. There are some of us that are more visual learners, some of us are more intuitive learners, you could say, and there are personality differences, but overall, reviewing and rehearsing seems to do quite a bit of a difference if we want to remember things. But let's continue. When we thought about letters, we thought about patterns and specific groups, right? It's easier to remember A, B, C, D as A, B, C, D, as opposed to B, C, A, D, because it's more natural, at least in the Western world, the Roman italocentric word, to remember that. If you follow, let's say, the Cyrillic alphabet, now, of course, you don't have A, B, C, you have A, B, B, etc. But we tend to remember things in chunks. Now, your question may be, okay, is there anything else, though, beside letters, in terms of what we review and what we remember? Is there anything more than visual learning? We mentioned flashbulb memories, right? Flashbulb memories refer to this vivid, detailed recollection of a emotional event, emotionally charged event, right? And how about something that we see? And many experiments actually have to do with what? With professional chess players, which is in itself fascinating because you would expect professional chess players to be very, very good at memorizing things. So in some of these experiments, what happened is that the experimenters showed the chess players, multiple chess players, some people that never played chess or just played for a little bit, were very beginner level, and some that were average level, and then professional levels. And they showed them a chessboard with randomly positioned chess pieces, right? So the queen was over there, the king was over there, the pawn was over there, the horse was in a different position, a completely random position. And then they asked to remember where did they see, if they remember the exact position of each piece, and that re-represent them, okay? Now, the curve here at the end of the experimentation, it's really, really interesting, okay? So again, one side, you see the number of correct pieces identified, right? From 0 to 30, right? And then the attempts every time that they try to do that. Now, as you can see here, that's the description in the white square, master, normal, okay? So normal position, as you would expect the pieces to be. The dark circle, master, randomized, okay? The black square, beginner level chess player with a normal chessboard with all the pieces in the correct order before you start. And then the white circle, beginner, randomized. The interesting thing is really the top curve. So the master normal really master almost every single piece after several attempts, right? But the lowest curve is actually the master random. So what this means is that the professional players score far less, far below the beginner level, which is at first counterintuitive, because you might assume that if you're a professional chess player, you might be much better at recognizing patterns because you are used to recognize patterns once you play chess, right? And yet the randomness of it was negatively affected by the expectation of the professional level player, because when a professional player looks at a chessboard, either they're so used to play, they remember the standard normal presentation, or if they see pattern, they already see patterns in terms of the possible response that they can rehearse before the next move, sometimes 2, 3, 4 moves in advance. And so they're less equipped in comparison to a person who, so to speak, fresh and has a new look to the board and has no visual mnemonic expectation. Quite fascinating. And so this is really something that has to do with both the expectation as well as the rehearsal. Now, do we have strategies again? Well, we mentioned mnemonics before. I mentioned the research by Alexander Luria and this fascinating journalist, this individual that was able to remember everything as a photographic memory. And then we have chunking. And I mentioned earlier the letters of the alphabet in the little trick experiment we did together. But just think about social security numbers or phone numbers or credit card numbers that are usually represented in chunks, right? For SS numbers, 342, phone numbers, at least in the US, okay? You have number 1 because of the United States code. Then you have the area code. In Vermont, it's 802, so 3 numbers, and then 3 numbers, and then 4 numbers, and then credit card number, 4 digits for 4 times. And this is easy because 4 chunks, in the cases of a credit card number, are easier to encode or to memorize and recall than if you were to learn 16 individual digits. So I did this again, all these letters, to memorize all these letters like that. It's really hard, but if you perform a chunking mechanism, you will organize the data into manageable units. So instead of AC, PC, VSS, et cetera, you have AAC, PCV, S, SU, etc. Important note, chunking works even better if we can assemble information to meaningful groups so that you might remember them according to previously encountered and possibly rehearsed, whether actively or passively, sometimes subconsciously, chunks. X, I, D, K, which very often it's one of those acronyms for I don't know, KFC, FBI, etc. Right? So those acronyms become a really good way to remember things. And this is something that very often is utilized in mnemonics and learning strategies. All right, so is there anything beyond that, beyond this kind of cognitive exercise? Well, biology still plays an enormous role, and that's really the underlying mechanism of memory. So we did mention long-term potentiation, right? In this little slide, I just want to show you dopamine level, right? And the fact that reinforcing is, chemically speaking, in this context, synonymous with amelioration and improvement, right? Amelioration of memory, so brain stimulation, right? So when we think about dopamine, usually we think of dopamine only or relatively only in terms of motivating physiological exercise-like activity, more physical than cognitive. But it's one of the most essential neurotransmitters that we utilize in this context. So this is just something to say that when we learn, just as when we do many other tasks, we do change our brain. We do stimulate our brain. Our brain changes in terms of levels of neurotransmitters, modulation neurotransmitters, and eventually in terms of neuroplasticity, it will change the connection, the synaptic activity of our brain. So sure, some of us might start off in a better way or on a better ranking on a grid, on a hierarchical grid, but the more you perform, the better you will perform. So practice, practice, practice. You can change your performance if you so choose, okay? Now, in theoretical models, what else can we say about memory? One of the models that you should remember is the Atkinson-Shiffrin model, all right? And there are 3 main parts, and then I added a 4th just for the neurochemical perspective. First, stimuli are recorded via sensory processes and held for between 1 and 2 seconds on average as sensory memory, right? This is the sensory register that we mentioned before, okay? First thing that happens that you have a lot of information. In fact, the sensory register is able to contain the biggest amount of information for the shortest amount of time. The opposite happens with short-term memory and eventually mid-term memory, etc. When you have relatively fewer amounts, so less amount of information, but for longer time. So at first, sensory register, more information, less time, and progressively less information, but for more time. So you'll be able to remember less things, but those things you remember will last long, right? So So sensory memory, neurosensory register, a couple of seconds, and then some of these will be processed into short-term memory. And of course, this happens through rehearsal. Okay, so going back, all those neurotransmitters play a significant role, right? And of course, we mentioned just that one, but acetylcholine and all of them still plays an essential role, especially if you think about things such as Alzheimer, and then as we will see, Korsakoff. After short-term memory, number 3, information will move into long-term memory, and this is where those pieces of information will be retrieved later. Now, I added number 4 from a chemical perspective because long-term memory is created through long-term potentiation, or LTP, which is essential to understand how plasticity in connection to memory works. Now, a little scheme here, all right, to review. So you have in yellow the input, whatever happens, right? All senses, all stimulation is whatever enters the system. And by system, of course, we mean our sensory system, our nervous system, et cetera, et cetera. So from input to observation, so the stimulus enters the system. I see something, I hear something, I touch something, I smell something, etc., right? This enters the sensory register, producing sensory memory, right? A couple of seconds, okay? After that, you have selective processes that will make it into working memory, which is what happens when we really reorganize the data. And then you can transfer from working memory into long-term memory. And within long-term memory, then you can retrieve it and reuse it into working memory to then create and modulate your performance, okay? So pretty straightforward. Now, it's more complex than that. So the next slide I want to show you here, and my advice for you will be to really stop the video and review each slide and create your own scheme using colors you want and symbols you want, because there are a few more labels. The next slide, it's a very simplified notion of what type of memories we have. Now, here I put human memories because that's what the research indicates. We will have another discussion when we will compare us with other animals, especially mammals, and other animal modeling studies. But you have, again, sensory memory, our sensory register. Here I put less than 1 second because it really depends what type of research patterns you want to utilize, what type of stimulation once it enters and what type of stimulation occurs, okay? But think about, 1 second and short-term memory. Then again, between 30 seconds and 1 minute, so less than 1 minute, the data varies because yet again, I said that some researchers claim that we should really utilize mid-term memory in between short-term and long-term memory, but definitely less than a minute from short-term memory, this working memory. And then long-term memory, which has multiple types. So the two big subdivisions, the first subdivision is between explicit and implicit. So declarative memory and non-declarative memory. In the first case, you have a conscious recall. In the second case, without conscious recall. Now, explicit memory, declarative memory, is further divided into semantic memory. Okay, think of sema, right? In Greek, the meaning, the word, right? So semantic memory refers to facts and general knowledge. And then episodic memory, just as an episode in a series, right? Which indicates personally experienced events. Now, for this non-conscious, non-declarative, implicit memory, you have procedural memory, motor and cognitive skills, priming, enhanced identification of objects or words, and then learning through classical conditioning. We mentioned Pavlov multiple times. I will show you a very, very interesting video that really indicates the difference between these memories and how a person can perform very well in one area and be completely lost, so to speak, in a different area. An example I can give you to you right away. It's like, think about yourself driving and maybe not paying enough attention to the details, to the point that sometimes you might drive for an hour, you almost have no recollection. You drove all the way to the destination. You reach destination without getting into an accident, without having any problem, but you lost a lot of things as if the time and space curve was somewhere lost. And so this is something that our brain allows for, putting things in standby. So I will show you a video that further illustrates that fascinating research. And this is connected to multiple other areas, including things such as narcolepsy or cataplexy. All right, let's continue. The next slide has to do with memory processing. Automatic on the left side and effortful on the right side. So with automatic, you have implicit memories, yet again, non-declarative, without conscious recall, right? Which is exactly what we see earlier, right? So blue is the same, right? This is processed in the cerebellum and basal ganglia, and we'll see how those parts play a role in some of the neurological problems we'll encounter in a few minutes. Space, time, and frequency, where you ate dinner yesterday, motor and cognitive skills, riding a bike as an example, and then classical conditioning, reaction to dentist's office. Effortful, explicit memory, declarative memories with conscious recall, process in the hippocampus and frontal lobes, okay? Remember the hippocampus especially. Again, facts and general knowledge, this chapter's concept, right? And personal experience events, family holidays, for instance. So here you have kind of the same schema as before, but this time with the added feature of, first of all, examples, and then the neural underpinnings and the neural or neuroanatomical, neurofunctional elements that are the underlying mechanisms and processes. Now, since we didn't mention the problems about memories, this is what we're going to do last. Now, I did mention confabulation and source misattribution before. And if you remember, confabulation has to do with a fabula, right? This tale, this fairy tale, this narrative in Latin. So it's a confusion on an event that happened to someone else with an event that happened to you. Or it could be a belief that you remember something when it never actually happened. This is confabulation. Versus source of misattribution that, as the name implies, has to do with the misattribution of the source, so this inability to distinguish an actual memory of an event from information you learn about the event elsewhere, right? So let's see how that plays a role. And one of the examples that I quoted here is one of the many studies by Loftus and Palmer. They asked people to watch a video of a minor car accident, and then the participants were asked how fast were the cars going where they hit each other, okay? Those who were asked when the car smashed into each other, okay, report higher speeds and remember broken glass that wasn't there. There are a variety of examples and studies in this area. Another one asked to watch a video where there was a yield sign, and they were asking multiple questions, and they asked the question by inserting words such as, what happened after you saw the, I think it was a Datsun car, this Japanese sport car, Datsun car stop? Was a hit after it stopped? And then they showed a picture and asked, which picture did you see? The one with the yield sign or with the stop sign? So despite the fact that previously the video they watched had no stop sign, but only yield, once the interviewer asked to whether they seen the car after they stopped, that created a false memory, which is really fascinating, also problematic, because especially in the context of the narrative we have, we might have a lot of problems, and we might even misattribute things because we will have this fake recollection of things that were never in the first place. So you have problems, for instance, with children's testimonies. They might remember things that never occurred to them, and sometimes this is a problem when people report being harmed or violated or abused or raped. And unfortunately, part of the issue is that you might retrieve things that were not there in the first place. So they might create a very unfortunate situation where the psychotherapist or the therapist in general they might work with, they were using leading questions that put memories that were not there in the first place. Or this happens also with eyewitness trials where witnesses are exposed to misleading information. Another thing that is very, very similar to this is where the person might remember things that are very, very similar. Like, for instance, you probably heard of the news of a wrongly convicted man and the accuser. And this one of the many stories, the one that was in the news in the late 80s, was the story by Ronald Cotton that was wrongly convicted of rape, and the conviction happened really on the basis of the eyewitness testimony, the testimony by Jennifer Thompson. And the person who was unfortunately the real rapist, Bobby Poole, was only identified later through a DNA test. And again, it's really something that happens to all of us. It's a manufacture of memories and the power of suggestion, which is really complicated because, as you can imagine, a person is already in a very vulnerable situation, very broken inside, and you're telling this person that their memory is not correct, that it's even more damaging. And yet, in terms of the ethics of it, we had to ask ourselves, which is worse, accusing a person of making up memories, so to speak, or having actually a person wrongly convicted for a murder or a rape or a violence that they did not commit. It's really, really, really difficult. There's plenty of examples in the literature, and unfortunately also in the news. Another one that happened in Australia was really interesting because there was this woman that reported being raped by a famous psychiatrist and researcher. This researcher actually had a perfect alibi because at the time, the precise time of the rape, he was actually giving a lecture on TV, was interviewed on TV, and his expertise was also in memory. So what happens is that multiple memories are mixed together, and they are, and especially if you have a strong emotional component to it, right? Because we mentioned the hippocampus and we mentioned the amygdala, and what type of interaction you have, the interference, right? You have retroactive and proactive interference. The proactive interference is forgetting that occurs when previously stored material interferes with the ability to remember similar, more recently learned material, right? So, and you also have state-dependent memory, which you remember something when the remember is in the same physical or mental state as during the original learning experience. And one of the experiments in this area were done, for instance, outside of the pool or underwater in the same situation. You see that the memory retrieval is definitely context or state dependent, right? You can also have, cue dependent forgetting or mood congruent memory, which is a tendency to remember experiences that are consistent with one's current mood, which might also mean that they overlook and forget experiences that do not fit, that they're not mood congruent, they're incongruent. But in any case, we might unfortunately create memories that are not there, right? Especially because children experience what we call infantile amnesia, which is the ability to remember events occurred earlier than age 2, because from a neurological perspective, they don't have the structure, the neural underpinnings strong enough to remember them, okay? So as you can imagine, this will be a very, very difficult issue, not just in clinical psychology, but also in legal aspect and in ethics, because how can we really decide as professionals, as clinicians, as psychologists, etc., whether something truly happened, and by that I mean something happened in reality or not, whether the person's memory and cognitive process was not accurate, so inaccurate that someone else was wrongly accused. And that's, really a debate between what's the worst case scenario, convicting someone because he was wrongly accused, or having a person who actually did suffer an abuse and people did not believe them. It's a really, really problem. It's a problem that, by the way, it's not just on a subjective level. Memory issues do not just affect the single individual, right? But they affect the individual in connection with society, okay? You probably are familiar with the Mandela effect, and you also are very familiar, I would assume, with the connection between memories, false memories, and propaganda. For instance, if I were to say something like this, 9/11, September 11, Until very recently, in most of the world, 9/11 was synonymous with the terrorist attack of the United States against Chile, right? Or at the very least, 9/11 as 9/11, 1973, the coup d'etat in Chile, the military overthrow of the Popular Unity government. And so every time a person in the world, the vast majority of cases, now there are always exceptions, heard 9/11, the immediate thing is, oh, 9/11, of course, Salvador Allende in Chile, the president of Chile that was the first Marxist to be elected in America, in a Latin American democracy, and the first Marxist to be democratically elected. So what happened on 9/11, on September 11, 1973? There was an attack, a military attack that was led by Augusto Pinochet, that seized power, and then this power seizure was, they turned out to be supported by the United States and the CIA. So, whether you think about conspiracy theory in general or declassified documents, and everybody what was involved, Nixon and Kissinger, the United States government. So everybody thought of 9/11 as this terrorist attack of Pinochet in Chile and the terrorist attack of the United States against a democratically elected president. Until you had a second 9/11 that, of course, in the memory of most people, at least in the United States, not necessarily in the rest of America, but at least in the United States, the modern 9/11 has to do with what happened in the Twin Towers in New York. And so this is already a problem of not so much memory, but interpretation of memory. On top of that, you had this aesthetic difference where the coup d'etat in Chile was not symbolized by just one single picture, one single video, also because it was in the 70s, the technology was nowhere as good as the one we found in the early 2000s, but also because it was less cinematic in its strength, like seeing these two aircrafts colliding with Twin Towers had a much more powerful, almost symbolic strength that was able to reconvene this new memory. So 9/11 from an American terrorist attack, a United States-led terrorist attack, to 9/11, a terrorist attack led against the United States. And there are a lot of kind of, I'm not sure if they should qualify that as false memory, as conspiracy theory, as the new 9/11 as a revenge for the old 9/11. I think it's really not solely based in scientific evidence, but nevertheless, those things can be mixed up together. And so you can also find the role of propaganda, government propaganda this time, where, for instance, in certain part of the world, the new 9/11 was juxtaposed to the old 9/11. So one terrorist attack coming from the United States, a new terrorist attack directly against the United States on the same level. Versus in other forms, you see that one is a war against terrorism and the other one is a terrorist-led war. Or you see 9/11, the Twin Towers, as the war the United States has lost, versus no, a terrorist attack outside of any war that was provoked by no true justified means, etc., etc. So this is just one example that creates a lot of problems, not just with the memory itself, the categorization of memories and the retrieval of memories, but also the way memories are interpreted and reinterpreted, which they change despite the fact that they were occurring in a very different social context. But let's continue. So you have consolidation process by which short-term memories are converted to long-term memories. And yet again, keep in mind that there might be a mid-term memory in between. And then these problems. So we talked about this manufacture of memory, confabulation, the models of memories, parallel distributed processing, or PDP, right? So connection among thousands of interacting units operating in parallel. We talked about the 3-box model memory, right? So you have sensory register, short-term and long-term memory. We talk about the problems in terms of testimonies and witnesses, etc. And then specifically, the terms I would like you to remember are in this area: anterograde and retrograde amnesia. So anterograde, ante, right, in front, right? So amnesia, so not remembering things that occur after the trauma or after the issue. And retrograde amnesia, retro, right? Amnesia for events occur just prior to the brain trauma. So as an example, Korsakoff syndrome. Korsakoff syndrome is a permanent anterograde amnesia caused by brain damage resulting from chronic alcoholism. Okay, so anterograde amnesia, again, you don't remember anything new. So patients that I have treated in the past that were unfortunately affected by Korsakoff syndrome will meet me, sometimes every day for weeks and months on end, and each time they did not have a clue who I was, or the fact that I treated them the day before, sometimes in the morning, because they could not create new memories. They only saw there. Other examples are subjects or individual patients that, despite the fact that they were like 60 years old, still thought of themselves as 20 and didn't have any recollection of something that happened after an event that could have happened after that biological age. Now, we mentioned confabulation. I just want to mention that confabulation is very often seen in people with Korsakoff syndrome, right? So the reporting of memories of events that did not take place without the intention to deceive. And that's an important element when we talk about free will and the ethics of memory. People are not aware they're not doing this on purpose. So if you will be a therapist, keep that in mind. That it's something that we have to master in terms of the knowledge of the neural underpinnings and not being projecting a bias in this sense, right? So again, it's true that people affected with these neurological problems can have memory problems. It's cool that preschoolers' memories are more vulnerable to suggestive questions than there are memory of school-age children. It's true that we might create more damage with improper, for instance, psychoanalytic way of questioning, or if you are in a police force, you need to master those skills in order not to change the narrative. It's true that we have to be extremely careful about the connection between context and mood and cues and everything else that's associated with memories. And maybe just to finish here, when we talked about the neural underpinnings of memory here, we had to think about two areas here. So we already mentioned Korsakoff's psychosis and this inability to perform well from a memory perspective, and then Wernicke. Very often, Wernicke encephalopathy and Korsakoff psychosis are connected in this acronym. If you will ever go to medical school, you will encounter this multiple times, the code REC, okay? So Wernicke's affects the brainstem, the cerebellum, and mammillary body. And in terms of symptomatology, you see confusion, C, ophthalmoplegia, O, ataxia, A, and T, thiamine deficiency, versus Korsakoff that affects the limbic system, R for retrograde amnesia, A for anterograde amnesia, C, confabulation, and K, of course, as the name implies, Korsakoff psychosis. Now, I do understand that at this level, we did not really talk about psychopathology yet. So since we discussed memory, I like to put it in, but don't you worry, this is probably beyond the level required for this course. I just feel I want to mention it in this area because it's part of what we're studying. So few more things before I let you go, perhaps to sum up. So you have two main areas to discuss in terms of how we remember. Let's start with the biological perspective. So you have changes in neuron and synapses, right? So in STM, so short-term memory, neurons temporarily change in their ability to release neurotransmitters, right? In LTM, so long-term memory, dendrites, if you remember those antenna-like structure, they grow and they branch out. The synapses increase in number, and then there's more flexibility and plasticity, so the synaptic pathway become more excitable. And this is really long-term potentiation, okay? They require some time for completion, during which memories undergo consolidation. So every time we think about long-term potentiation, we think about the biology of memory. the fact that you have a plasticity, a growth, right? Neural growth, neuroplasticity, right? So dendrites grow, they branch out, more synapses, and strengthening of the neurotransmission, okay, in general. Now, in terms of how memories are located in our brain, right? We mentioned the amygdala multiple times, fight and flight response, emotional encoding, formation, consolidation, retrieval of fearful and strong emotional memories. You have frontal lobes that are involved in short-term memory and in working memory. Hippocampus, critical to the formation and retrieval of long-term declarative memories. Cerebellum that helps form and retain certain procedural memory. And of course, cerebral cortex that covers it all, right? Ultimate destinations. But it's not just the brain itself. You have hormones, neurotransmitters, and then emotion. So hormones are released by the adrenal glands to enhance memory, and they are connected to arousal in terms of strengthening or weakening the memory, right? So this is something that I really want you to remember. So we remember through mnemonics, through chunking, through rehearsal, right? To deprocessing, and then we forget due to decay or not performing and not rehearsing, and also forgetting may occur because of proactive and retroactive interference, right? So that something happens in our attempt to remember things. So just as the ancient would compare memory to a soft wax tablet that would preserve anything in print on it, our brain attempts to do the same thing. And you have, again, this biopsychosocial model of memory, where the biology is all these things we just mentioned, neural structure and neurotransmitters and hormones. The psychological, all the patterns that we mentioned, including learning and conditioning, and the social, all the cues, the context-based, and this interference that might occur.
All right, so this concludes our conversation on memory, Module 5 for Intro to Psychology. Thank you very much. Also, I will add, just as I did in the previous weeks, a little slideshow, a little PowerPoint that further describes the things we discussed today. Now, of course, you can only access these materials if you are enrolled in class. If you're watching this video for free on YouTube, you will not be able to access those materials. But in any case, if you have any questions or comments, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in Module 6. Bye-bye.